You are watching Xirtus.
Everything is inverted now. We have everything that I remember growing up, and the things that I believe that people who are liberal Democrats believed, which they don't believe anymore, and now they believe things that are fascist, like literally doctrinaire fascist, like liberalism today as practiced in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party for that matter is doctrinaire fascism in every single way. It's just
But
that we
doesn't that
don't
make you
recognize
think?
it because it's friendly fascism.
But yeah, doesn't that make you think that at one point, fascism must have just meant like water fountains in France and Spain or something? Like it must have been like this is the thing. Like there's an inversion of everything, always, always.
Well, I think that, here's the thing. People have this idea about elites that they're like mustache twirling baddies who just want to do bad. That's not the problem. The problem with the elites is the exact opposite, is that they think they're right and virtuous and good and true. And they think that we're just the obstacles at best. At best, we're the obstacles. At worst, we're just, spoiled children screwing everything up. I mean, they have these great plans, which personally, I think are all insane. But they think they're the good guys. And
Like
that's something
Lucifer
that I
thinks they're more
really,
right than God.
you asked me about our Gods with Spandex. That's something that I really came to realize, when I was doing a lot of the reading on Gods with Spandex, is that, all the great superhero comic book villains all think they're the good guys. They don't think they're the
Oh
bad
my
guys.
God, dude. I don't, this doesn't have to be right now, but what a segue ultimately, like for that book, because I just watched the new Joker. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's getting
Yeah.
a lot of flack from all the critics. I have a few things to say as it
You know
relates to
what?
what you
You
were
know
just
what?
talking
I've
about.
got to
No pun
say
intended, right? Flack. Get
Mhm.
it?
we used to
Flack.
Oh,
we
flack. Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
we used to be so grateful to be offended by a movie. What happened to us as a society? This is what scares me.
Mm,
You
right.
know.
Totally.
well, I think what happened, I'll tell you exactly what happened, is that there's a certain coterie of people who came from cultural studies programs and discovered that they had no real marketable skills. So let's go to Hollywood and take over these writer rooms and so on, and
Mm,
and infiltrate all these production studios and so on and so forth. And I mean, this is a very long story, but it went from being just sort of like the weirdos who will work 70, 80, 90 hours a week because they have no other life, to being, oh well, we're going to start to dictate because I hired all my friends to fill all these positions. People will just or sleep at the switch, and all this crazy stuff started coming in, like this, whatever, but whatever they call it. I'm not. I don't want to get in because I don't want to get into a political thing. But it all just
Altruistic educational entertainment.
they all they all killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. Now
mm,
I knew this. See, I don't know if you guys knew it, but I worked for Marvel for 25 years, and 15 of those years were working for the Marvel Studios as a freelancer, and all the movies. I mean, all of them. You know, up until the Eternals, and that was the last time they needed any work from me because they killed the goose that laid the golden eggs. People don't realize that the revenue stream from the movies is only part of it. It's all the toys and the T-shirts and the lunch boxes and all the
mhm,
tchotchkes and you name it. That is such a huge part of the revenue stream. And they started making movies that kids didn't like.
mhm.
And when you turn off that audience, young boys, you're dead. I mean, you're literally dead. And I'll tell you something. I mean, I haven't done any work. So I started working for Marvel in 1995. Last thing I did for them is 2020. Haven't done anything since. And I still keep in touch with people I used to work with. There's nothing going on. You can go on YouTube and see all these videos of like tens of thousands of unsold Marvel toys in these discount stores and so on. So, but that was our substitute religion. You know, you were asking me about the superheroes and stuff. So, what I think happened, and I charted this out on the blog, is that we had the wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, and that was going to be the big show. I grew up, with hearing evangelical Christians saying, once we get into Babylon, once we get into tanks in the Middle East, the skies will open and the Lord will descend and then everything will happen. Well,
thankfully, I heard most of that in reggae instead, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, basically what happened, it was just an absolute disaster on so many different levels, and we're still suffering the consequences of that. So I think that the mass, just sort of the normies, the sames, the pinks, the mediums, the whatevers, they just needed something new to glom onto. And I think superheroes became, and that's why I wrote that book, the substitute gods. But that's over now. I mean, you talk about that Joker movie. I mean, I thought the first Joker movie was fantastic. But if you need a better indication that it's over, that the gods have gone back to Valhalla, our adopted gods have returned, from whence they came. I mean, that's.
So did you watch it? You've seen the new Joker movie?
No,
Okay, well, I was telling Andreas before this podcast that my feeling is that if a movie gets such terrible reviews, we have license to spoil. So that's my rationalization.
I hope you feel like that. I hope you do.
I think I read I think I'm familiar with your theory, though. Go ahead.
Oh, what did you got? Oh, really? Okay, so basically, first of all, like if I approach anything related to the Joker, I'm looking at it through a Golden Bough lens, like automatically, just because the nature of the archetypal fool, the Green Man, everything tied to so, and that's far-reaching. This is a larger conversation.
You screwed me up for the Olympics, by the way. I had to look it through the Green Man too. Thanks a lot.
Okay, yeah. So, there's a point at which he's forced. So his argument in court is that he's got a split, right? That there's the Joker and then there's Arthur. And so they're trying to make the argument that it wasn't Arthur who committed these crimes, it was Joker, and that he's pleading insanity, right? Well, there comes a point where he's questioning Puddles, who's the little guy who he let go in the first one, right? First of all, there's another big factor here, and that's that the first one was like, it's completely purposely, overtly synchronistically tied, same synchronistic in this case, I'm still saying that it's intentional, with the King of Comedy. Also,
that was obvious. I mean,
it's so obvious to anybody who's seen the King of Comedy, and that's the thing about
it was intentional,
right?
Yeah.
So it's the king. So he killed the king, right? And then he became the king. So you have, I'm sure you've probably seen Alan Green's series, Hindsight 2020. He goes deep into the ritualistic killing of the king and how this relates to, we see this all communicated politically, and he shows the Lion King thing with Obama and all of this stuff, like that correspondence dinner, how important that was, like just symbolically or whatever. But anyway, he's in court and he realizes that he let that guy go, right? And he says to him, he goes to Arthur, he says, "You were the only one who was nice to me." And so he flips. So total spoiler, I don't give a fuck, sorry. But he tells the court, he ends up telling the court that he is Arthur. He is not Joker. He acknowledges the shadow, and the movie starts out with a shadow with this cartoon where he's fighting with his own shadow. So it's got that Jungian thing of like, like the Red Book, where it's like, okay, he's acknowledged, like, this is actually me, like this is one thing. And then right after that, there's an explosion, and activists bust him out or whatever. He ends up escaping. But when they read the verdict, they say New York. They do not say Gotham. And then shortly thereafter, he's back in Gotham, and they say Gotham again. And I saw that, and I was like, and so Harley Quinn, Lady Gaga's character, right? Like, she gets all dressed up with the makeup. She's going to the courthouse. She thinks they're gonna have it's all fantasy, but she's not in love with Arthur. She's in love with Joker. She's in love with the fantasy. And so it's the moment that he breaks from the fantasy, and he's in court too. So it's like it's loaded, because he's like, this is on record right now. I'm saying, and I killed my mom, by the way, is what he says, And so, but that point speaks to everything that we're talking about in a way, because you're describing what has happened with Marvel. Of course, this is DC, but it's still, these things are connected. Like there's the projection of the fantasy. This is our gods wear spandex. Like, we're relating to this layer as though it's the thing in itself, when really it's just like the skin of the snake. It's not the body of the thing. Like the whole deal is taking place in New York, but he's not living there. he's living in Gotham. So it's like to break from that spells his own destruction. So he ends up getting killed. So it's I'm totally
There's an interesting point that I want to raise, and getting back to this whole idea of the end of a cycle. So, David, do you remember the whole thing back in 2008? You know, the synchromistic community was just on fire, you know, when Heath Ledger died, and everybody was doing these huge things about Dark Knight and Heath Ledger and so on and so forth. I mean, I did quite a bit of that myself. But it seems to me that we're seeing like Janus, right? We're seeing the Joker Janus. You know, we're seeing the opening and the closing, or, you know, like the little baby and then the old man with the scythe. You know, it's like we're seeing, I kind of feel that we're seeing the end, that the Joker marks the end. The Joker really marked the beginning, right? The Joker really marks the beginning of that superhero age. I mean, you did have, you know, X-Men, Spider-Man movies and so on and so forth. But it's really the Dark Knight which lights the fire. And
so correct. And who do we have to thank for that? We have Alan Moore, a Thelemite. I know, you know, like it's not just that he's a Thelemite too. It's also his whole trip, like where, you know, and he's always been fighting. He's been fighting to keep his movies from his graphic novels from being made into movies, and like over and over again. He didn't want Swamp Thing to be a movie. He didn't want V for Vendetta to be a movie. He didn't want The Watchmen to be a movie, and they did it anyway. And it's one of those weird cases where it's like, wow, like they're really not this. It's the line of power between the artist, the creator himself, and then the industry. You know, and he's always been up against that. But he was the first person to introduce Batman as the Dark Knight. And we have with the Killing Joke, which was the Joker, and then you have the Man Who Laughed.
Whoa.
Am I wrong?
Yeah, Frank Miller, Dark Knight Returns, 1985. That was
1985.
3 years before
Miller. How long before he did Sin City? He did a Batman. Tell me about this. You're the person to talk to. Okay.
Oh, the Dark Knight Returns, bro.
So Frank Miller did Daredevil. He made his bones with Daredevil in the late 70s, early 80s, went over to DC and did The Dark Knight Returns. And that really starts Batmania as we know. You know, that 4 years later, that ends up with the Tim Burton movie, where, I don't know if you remember, but I remember going into New York in the spring for Earth Day, and everybody was wearing a Batman, some variation on a Batman shirt. You know, a lot of them wore bootlegs and so on. But that was really the start of Batmania. It was the Dark Knight Strikes Again. And a lot of the plot lines in that series showed up in those Christopher Nolan movies. Okay. A lot of the ideas sort of did pop up in that. But Alan Moore came a little bit later. So that was 2008, because he was doing the Swamp Thing at the time. And, you know, one of the things I wrote about, I mean, it's obvious in the title, The Killing Joke. He was playing off the iconography of the band Killing Joke, who really started the whole idea of the truly malicious Joker, like the murderous kind of, because, you know, the Joker used to be a ridiculous character, you know, if you remember in Batman. And it was really, so like late 70s, early 80s, when Killing Joke comes around, and they're playing with all this like really dark Joker and jester and trickster kind of imagery. That is what, I mean, clearly what Moore was drawing on, because he was, you know, he's friends with guys like Love and Rockets and stuff. Didn't he say he took it from The Man Who Laughs, that old silent film? And then there's also that's the character. That's the original inspiration for the character. Yeah.
In the first place.
And realistically, like Dick Tracy characters.
Okay, but there's also the Bat.
Joker.
Oh, I'm sorry. The silent film, The Bat. You guys know about that? So like where the Bat is actually like he's a murderer / burglar, and but he's got the like a more realistic, but it's a Batman head where like he's like sneaking around, and at one point the bat signal shows up and moves across the room. Looks exactly like the bat signal, and everybody's looking at it and they're like, "What the hell?" And then it turns out it's a moth on a headlight.